Hey, church family, I've got a question for you. And my question is, do you expect suffering as a follower of Jesus? I think it's a fair question because I've talked to a lot of people who frankly don't. They feel as though if they're followers of Jesus, that should kind of mean they get a pass when it comes to the suffering of this life. The fact is, the New Testament has a lot to say about suffering. The Apostle Peter, who wrote his letters during a time of great suffering among those who were followers of Jesus Christ, had a lot to say about this. If you were a Christian living in the first century in the Roman Empire, life wasn't easy. The governing authority in the land was a madman named Emperor Nero. Historians remember Nero for having Christians burned at the stake and using their flaming bodies to light up his garden. It's difficult to imagine such hatred for God and for his people. But that was what those first followers of Christ were up against. Peter wrote a letter to those first century Christians to let them know that God had not abandoned them in their suffering, and that suffering was part of the will of God. Writing in 1 Peter 4, Peter says, "Dear friends, don't be surprised at the fiery trials you're going through, as if something strange were happening to you. Instead, be very glad, for these trials make you partners with Christ in his suffering, so that you'll have the wonderful joy of seeing his glory when it's revealed to all the world." The reason that Peter could tell them don't be surprised and that suffering is to be expected was because Peter had spent 3 years walking with Jesus. And over, Jesus had tried to prepare his disciples for what was ahead. In John 15, Jesus told them, "If the world hates you, remember that it hated me first. The world would love you as one of its own if you belong to it. But you're no longer part of the world. I chose you to come out of the world, so it hates you." It seems at least a little strange, in an age of increasing tolerance, that people seem to be growing more and more intolerant of Christians. And yet that's what we're seeing. As Christ followers, how should we respond to this? Should we be shocked and outraged? Should we fight back? The answer is no. We should expect it. This is not some strange new phenomenon. And even in the midst of suffering, God calls us to continue to love our neighbors and pray for our enemies. He calls us to remember that if we're experiencing suffering for the sake of Christ, that's exactly what Jesus told us would happen. Whether or not we will suffer is often beyond our ability to control. What we can control is how we respond to suffering when it comes our way. My prayer is that God would give us the grace to suffer well, and that in the process, we would point others to Jesus, the one who's promised us that if we're today sharing in his suffering, there's a day coming when we'll share in his glory. May that promise give us hope during the tough times. Amen.